All right, well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So we are continuing our class in on just a second. Here, you can pass these down. I don't have week 2 here, but these are previous, in case you're interesting. Yeah, it is online, so. All right, so welcome to week 4 of our series on Introduction to Messianic Judaism. This week, we're going to be looking particularly at Jewish practices, prayer, and kashrut. As I mentioned before, this is really like very much a crash course. I realize it's a lot of information, but it'll at least kind of give you a little bit of a taste of some of the discussions that are relevant, as well as some places like, especially we draw a lot from the standards of observance from the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. And so you can find a lot of that in, questions and things on the MJRC website. You can sit here if you want, just open or wherever you want.
That's okay.
Too much junk. That's okay. That's fine.
Oh, sure, that's her excuse.
So Avinu, thank you for this time to learn together, and as iron sharpens iron, I pray that we would sharpen one another. So we lift this time to you and the guidance of your Ruach in the name of Yeshua. Amen. All right, so just to kind of a quick recap, the first week we looked at, let me see if I have it here. The first week was an introduction to Judaism and the Jewish holidays. And then we talked a little bit last week about the role of halakha, right, of the Jewish way of life, as well as the concept of faith in action, which goes really well with the sermon series that I'm doing right now on the book of James. And then last week, we looked at an introduction to the life cycles and to the synagogue. So this week, we will kind of continue the idea of the synagogue as we look at prayer. And then we will also talk about sort of the diet for the soul, right, of kashrut. And if any of that, you don't know what I mean or what any of that is, then we will probably unpack that. And so you'll have a better sense of where we're at. So we've been talking about, and again, if you have questions, just feel free to jump in, that Judaism is more than a religion. It is a particular way of life and cultural expression of faith in the God of Israel, right? As such, choosing to take on certain Jewish observances should be done with care and knowledge and cultural sensitivity. When we speak about Jewish observance, I like to encourage that when you think about this, that it needs to be manageable, meaningful, and maintainable. So what I mean by manageable is like, don't take on something that you can't do. Let's say you leave this class today and you're so excited about kashrut that you're going to totally have a kosher kitchen and separate dishes and like the whole like, whoa, right? That's too much too soon, because that might not be manageable for in your case, right? Or maybe like, let's say, for example, you live with roommates or you have a spouse who's not into any of this stuff. And so trying to force this on them is going to be really tough when you start saying, I'm going to change our entire kitchen, right? So what I just mean is like, it needs to be something that is manageable, that is a commitment that if you feel like you want to begin to take on, that is doable. Number 2, it needs to be meaningful. Sometimes we do things because we just want to be obedient. But often you can pray about, God, if there's something that you want me to take on, like, show me that, like find a way to, and also understand what you're doing. It's really important that you understand why we do what we do. And if you are going to maintain a certain level of observance, like why, right? And it's got to be meaningful for it to really stick. And that goes to the third thing, is this idea of maintainable. Not only is it just manageable in the immediate sense, and meaningful, but a lot of times, and I've seen this happen over and over and over again, somebody's new to a Messianic synagogue, they get super excited about everything, and like they're taking on everything, and like, show up and they look like a chassid or whatever, and then 6 months later they're gone, right? They're not even walking with God anymore. It's like, it needs to be maintainable. Like throughout our lives, both our spirituality and even our observance is going to go up and down a little bit, right? And that's okay, that's normal. But what you don't want is you take on something that was unmanageable and it just burns you out. And so now you're not doing anything, right? So these are just a couple of things to be thinking about when we're talking about Jewish observance. As I always encourage, if your observance is not drawing you closer to God, then there is something wrong. The problem is not the Torah, but often the way it is interpreted and applied, right? Because the whole idea is the commandments are supposed to be 613 different ways that we connect to God. And if you're not connecting to God through them, then something's wrong. So let's back up for a second, right? And really look at this. So before taking on particular practices and observances, one should consider, and this is not the limitation of questions, these are just some things to think about. What is the meaning and purpose of this practice? What are the origins of this practice? Why do I want to observe this practice? What are my motives for taking on this practice, right? If I'm really doing it to like look all holy and I want everybody, or are you really doing this because you feel like you want to draw closer to God? This is Matthew's conviction. In Matthew 23, records Yeshua's criticism of a certain group of scribes and Pharisees. And he says, you wear your tefillin, which we talked about a little bit last week, or, really broad, and you wear your tzitzit, the fringes on your tallit super long. Why? So that everybody sees you doing it, right? And you stand at length in the street corner, right? Everything you do is to be seen by others. Instead, Yeshua said, you're supposed to go into your prayer closet. It's not that we don't wear things like a kippah or anything, but it's what's our motivation for doing it? Is it really more out of pride, or is it out of wanting to be obedient to God? Those are the kind of things that we should. So also, how do I do it correctly? If you are going to do something, you should not just make up your own rules. Like, it drives me nuts when people are like, oh, I want to. You see this a lot, like sometimes with Christians who like heard some teaching about a prayer shawl, and so like now they want a prayer shawl, but they're going to do it their own way with like their own seed, and like I've seen a lot of weird stuff. So if you're going to do it, it needs to be done correctly. And another question is, if I take on this practice, what impact or reaction will it have upon or elicit from others? The other thing that you should think about, and there's only a few circumstances in which this is even applicable, is especially if you're not Jewish, should I do this? There's a few mitzvot, and we'll talk about those more when we get to the section on Gentiles in Messianic Judaism. There's, I think, 5 or 6 mitzvot, which we call sign commandments. They're not just like general commandments, but they have to do specifically, they're meant to be a sign between the covenant between God and Israel, right? And so those are the things that we discourage Gentiles from doing. But we'll talk more about that in the future. So that's another consideration to probably throw in. So let's talk about prayer. Any questions so far? Okay. So admittedly, well, I don't want to hear myself drone on and on. Let's go around, and if people want to read one of the paragraphs. So who wants to start with the first one under Jewish prayer?
Yes, I will.
Yeah, please, Marianne, go for it.
Admittedly, Jewish prayer can be intimidating, especially with all its liturgy, practices, and traditions. However, when one begins to understand the structure and purpose of a Jewish prayer service, it becomes possible to also see the beauty of this rich tradition. Judaism is a religion of sacred drama, meaning that through our services and observances, we don't just remember the events of the past, we reenact them and participate in them.
And we talked before when we talked about sacred drama, and for example, Passover, this concept actually comes from the Bible itself. In Deuteronomy is one of the places where there are 4 places in the Torah where it says, when your child asks you, what is the reason why we do these things? And each time it's actually in relation to Passover, you're supposed to tell them, right? And, and then when it retells the commandments for Passover, you're supposed to do this with your staff in hand, right? With your coat on. Why? Because when you say, when God delivered me from Egypt, why is that significant in Deuteronomy? Because it's the generation that didn't experience these things, right? It's the children and grandchildren of that. And yet it's still saying you're experiencing Passover, right? And you're supposed to tell your children when God delivered me from Egypt. What do you mean God delivered me from Egypt? Because every year we relive it. And that Egypt for each one of us might not be a physical place, but we are all being delivered from something, right? All right, so who wants to read the next? Okay, thank you, Gail.
For example, the Torah service is a weekly reenactment of the giving of the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. When we participate in the Torah service, we fulfill the verse that states, Adonai did not make this covenant just with our ancestors, but with us, with all of us who are here alive today, Deuteronomy 5:3 and 29:15. Every week we have the opportunity to receive the Torah and renew our commitment to follow God and his instructions for our lives.
That passage from Deuteronomy 5:3 is, all of us are familiar with the Ten Commandments as they are in Exodus, but they're repeated in Deuteronomy. There's actually a little slight difference between the two. But after that, it gets into this idea that Adonai did not make this covenant just with our ancestors, meaning with those who stood at Mount Sinai, but it says that he also made it with us. There's this sense in Jewish tradition that all Jews stood at Mount Sinai. It doesn't matter when you were born, right? All right, so who wants to read the next paragraph? Teresa, thank you.
As a dramatic reenactment, the structure of the service tells a story and moves you through different things. Within the Shabbat morning service, we recall themes of God's creation, redemption, and greatness. We relive the crossing of the Red of the Sea of Reeds, the giving of the Torah, and are caught up in worship alongside the angels in heaven. The Jewish worship service is truly a beautiful and unique experience.
I was thinking about today, and I was going to say something, and then I just forgot, of kind of encouraging people at times to read the footnotes in the prayer book.
Oh, I
Because we spent
try to do
good
that.
is that because what it does is it helps to provide meaning for prayers that you're not sure where we are or what to do, right?
Yeah.
Not only does it give you choreography instructions, but also what I would call covenant instructions, our intention and the way that we're supposed to approach it,
Right.
and think about it. And it's also okay if at times you just follow along in English. That's totally okay, right? Or even there are times with me, and I'm, super familiar with the service in Hebrew, but sometimes on purpose, when I pray the Amidah privately at home, in my morning prayers, I'll every once in a while on purpose pray it in English, right? Just to kind of, because you get something different out of it, especially since, English is obviously my native language and not Hebrew. So even though I can understand the Hebrew, it's just different when you read something in the language that you know. If you don't have for example, a Siddur, for example, in Espanol, you should do that, right? Because there's going to be something powerful about reading it in
your own
something
language.
that you can
That's
understand. And as we mentioned in the introduction to our new Siddur, is that our service tries to find a balance between putting it in the vernacular, like the language that we all know, and yet maintaining this importance of the Hebrew. A few months ago, or several months ago, I did a whole sermon on the importance of Hebrew. Like, why do we even bother with the Hebrew? And there are many wonderful reasons, but one of them is not only does it unite us with all Jews and Jewish communities and Messianic Jewish communities today, but also throughout history, right? It's one of the things that really link us together. And most of it is drawn, 90% of it is straight from scripture. The other thing that's important is, and I really experienced this when I was doing my internship and I moved to Hungary, and I went to a synagogue there the first time. I didn't speak Hungarian, I just moved there. So I had no clue what the sermon was about or certain things, but I could pray with everyone. I could participate in the service, and it doesn't matter where I go. I can go to a synagogue in, whether it's in Israel or in Germany or Hungary or, well, there's only one Jew left in Iraq, but anyway, like other than like soldiers and but anyway, wherever I go, I can participate in the service if if you're familiar with the service enough. So there's many other reasons that the Hebrew is important, but it's just something to think about. So any questions so far? Yes.
Something I never asked about when you pray and, especially watching you, when you're bowing down,
Uh-huh.
can you tell me?
That's a good question.
History on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So some of the bowing has to do with the choreography of the service. So there are certain places in which we bow when we do like bend our knees and bow. Places like the Baruch Hu, at the beginning and end of the opening paragraph of the Kedusha, of the Amidah, for example. So there are certain times in which we're doing it because it's part of the choreography of the prayer. So really Jewish prayer is all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, just in the sense of like there's things we say, things we're supposed to be thinking about, things that we're supposed to do, right? So there's different things. The other times you'll see me and you'll see other, like especially like Josh or others like who are kind of what's called shuckling, right? It was just like, and it's just more of like your body's into it, and so it doesn't have like a particular meaning. It's just part of the like, and the more you familiarize with it, the more that you just kind of connect with what you're doing, and it's just happens. Anyway, that's called shuckling.
What is shuckling?
Shuckling is this, like when you're studying or when you're praying or whatever, it's just this, kind of rhythm that you get into. So it doesn't have any kind of a formal meaning, but it's just part of like the more that one becomes familiar with like in like the Jewish prayer, and it really especially came out of like the Hasidic movement. But
When you go to the left, you bow to the left and to the right, there's certain times.
right. So at the end of when we say Oseh Shalom B'Mromav, right?
Yeah.
The one who makes peace in the heavenly worlds, make peace for us, right? So on that's the choreography of prayer.
Yeah.
So we take 3 steps back.
Yeah.
Because that's
Right.
especially at the end of the Amidah. That at the beginning of the Amidah, the word Omed means to stand, and so the Amidah is like the central prayer, and we're going to see. I'll get to it in a second, but if you look on page 4, you see this climax in the service, and the Amidah is like part of the climax of the service that's when we begin the Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu Elohei Avraham. Right. So when you begin the Amidah, you're supposed to take 3 steps back first. Is kind of like preparation, right? Just kind of you're just sort of like getting, stepping away from the condition in which you entered, right? You take 3 steps back, like stepping away from whatever it is that you just need to leave behind in order to really enter prayer. And then you take 3 steps forward. And the rabbis say, why do we take 3 steps forward? It's that idea of like stepping into the presence of God. Here's, I think, this word. And so then when we end the Amidah, we take 3 steps back, like stepping away from, it's like the whole symbolism was like when you go to meet like a king, right? Or
There's
queen, right? There's certain things you do, like you bow, you do different things, right? And you kind of walk backwards a few steps before you turn. So when we're approaching the creator of the universe, the king of the universe, right, we're supposed to also act in a humble way. And so traditionally at the end of the Amidah, then we take 3 steps back. And then when we say those words, may the one who makes peace in the heavenly realms make peace for all of us, for all of Israel and all the nations of the world. That's it. So, then what we do is kind of we acknowledge like that God's presence is as everywhere, right? So we bow to the left, to the right, and then forward. And then that's how we conclude the Amidah so there's different choreography and one of these times we'll have more of a series of classes on the liturgy itself, right? Which would be helpful, but I can't hit all of that in one class, today. Otherwise we'll take a while for the next, forever. So let's go back. Any other questions? And like I said, this is just more of a a general overview, but any questions on so far that we've talked about, either this concept of sacred drama or just prayer in general? And we're going to talk more about prayer, but we good? Okay. So last week we talked a lot about the history of where the synagogue came from and a little bit of the synagogue service. But just as a quick recap. So as discussed last week, the synagogue is a Jewish place of worship and is often the center of Jewish communal life. The terms for a Jewish place of worship, whether it's in Greek, synagoga, or in Hebrew, Beit Knesset, both refer to a place of assembly. Many Jews in Western countries will also refer to a synagogue as a temple. However, many more traditionally minded Jews will not use this reference, as it is seen to depreciate the role of the Jerusalem temple in Jewish thought and its anticipation of being rebuilt. Obviously, most Christians don't realize that they actually also look forward to the rebuilding of the temple, right? The third temple, which is one of the signs that the Messiah will return, is when that temple gets rebuilt, then the Messiah is going to return. But Jews especially anticipate its rebuilding. And we have many prayers that anticipate its rebuilding. Because of our faith in Yeshua, and this is specifically Messianic, congregations, because of our faith in Yeshua and our understanding of the New Testament, as a Messianic synagogue, we maintain our primary commitment as a Jewish place of worship, yet also welcome and include those from non-Jewish backgrounds who are called to support and actively participate in the life and destiny of the Jewish people, right? That's one of the unique things about a Messianic synagogue, is that you have Jews and non-Jews worshiping together. And the other thing that we do is actively include. It's not like Gentiles are just spectators within our congregation, they're active participants in the life of our community, in the leadership, in the services themselves. There are certain things that for covenantal reasons, they're really minor things that we, in our synagogue, we tend to, the Torah reading is only for Jews, and that has to do with the blessing that you recite. Not that Gentiles can't study the Torah, but when you say the blessing, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, who's chosen us among all the peoples of the world, doesn't mean chosen in the sense of faith in Yeshua. It means chosen in the sense of the covenant that was made between God and the Jewish people on Mount Sinai. And the New Testament makes clear in Acts 15 and other places that Gentiles share in the blessings of Israel, but they don't become Israel. They don't become Jews through faith in Yeshua. So Jews are still in this sort of covenantal relationship, and Gentiles are brought into it and through faith in Yeshua, but don't have the same necessarily obligations. So anyway, we can talk. We'll talk, more about this in I forget which week. Anyway, we'll get there. So I want to just cover two. There are different prayer garments in Judaism today. We're going to talk today about the two that you're most familiar with seeing at our synagogue on Shabbat, but I already mentioned tefillin. Tefillin are, if you've ever seen pictures of it, I could pull it up on my computer, but where you see people praying like in Israel, or the reason why you don't see it on Shabbat is because we don't wear them on Shabbat, but tefillin are these leather boxes that you wear, one on your forehead, one on your arm. And it's from Deuteronomy 6:4-9 from the Ve'ahavta, when it says she'll bind them as a sign on your, between your eyes and a sign on your arm, right? So the passage, so it has the one on your arm has that passage, and then the one on the forehead actually has 4 compartments, and it has the 4 places that it commands us to put tefillin on. And so those are the passages that we wear. So we literally bind it to our, and this goes back to biblical times. So not only are tefillin mentioned in Matthew 23, but we have in archaeological discoveries, for example, at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, they found tefillin. They look a little different than they do now, but even from before the time of Yeshua, the way that they observed binding them as a sign on your arm and putting them as a sign between your eyes, they understood this in a literal sense. In the same way, a mezuzah, like, so if you go into a Jewish home
Right.
or you look around the synagogue, like this, right? Inside of this is also the Shema and the Ve'ahavta. Like where it tells us in the Bible to do it is what's inside the scroll. In Hebrew, it has those passages. So as a way to write them on your doorposts, like we don't literally write them on the doorpost, but what we do is we write them, put them in the scroll, in a box, and the box doesn't matter.
Right.
It's what's inside of it that matters, and that is attached to your doorpost. As a kid, I remember in Ben-Hur. Did anybody ever see Ben-Hur?
Oh, yeah.
So if you're Jewish, you would have recognized that their mezuzah was an actual hole inside the wall of the door where they had this scroll sitting in. And I always thought that was cool. Like there was actually built. So next time you watch Ben-Hur, notice on the door, like there's like a big cut into the actual door frame as a place where they put the scroll. That's the mezuzah. Whether they actually did that in ancient times, I don't know. You would think I would, but I don't actually, but I think it's cool. All right, so things like tefillin are a prayer garment. You'll also see, if you see religious Jews, especially Hasidim, who wear their tzitzit out, that underneath your clothes, like there's a talit katan, a smaller talit that you wear under your clothes. Most religious Jews tuck in the tzitzit, but Hasidim and others will wear them out. So if you see people wearing the tzitzit, the fringes, that's what it is. It's from something that you wear under your clothes. But so let's talk about first is a kippah, like this, right? Any kind of a head covering. So a kippah, or in Yiddish, a yarmulke, some of you might be familiar with that term. A yarmulke is, so one's Yiddish, the other one's Hebrew. Kippah just means a covering. Yarmulke is, there's debate among linguists about where this term comes from. Some people believe it's a squishing together of two words, Yorem Elohim, to stand in awe of God or to fear of God. And so, because the whole point of why we do it is two things. One, in the sense of recognizing that the presence of God is everywhere. The other reason is cultural. So in Western cultures, as a sign of respect, like if you go into a courtroom or something, you're supposed to take a hat off, right? In Eastern cultures, including in Israel, when you go into a courtroom or especially a place of worship, you cover your head, right? And so the other thing is that there's a teaching that because Jews are supposed to be slaves only to God, that and in ancient times, slaves covered their heads. And so like we do it to show that we're slaves to God. But there's this real sense of, especially with the word kippah, of a covering is like a reminder that the presence of God is everywhere. The other reason is that, at least within the Bible, the only people who were supposed to cover their heads were the priests, right? It does talk about that they're supposed to wear turbans. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of covering your head, even in ancient times, came from this idea that all Jews are in some way a kingdom of priests in a holy nation, right? And so we all serve God in different ways. And so out of that service to God, when you're doing especially something in a religious context to cover your head. So on a personal note, I would initially discourage people from wearing a kippah outside of a synagogue, especially if you're not Jewish, because in the wider Jewish community, wearing a kippah does not mean that you're Jewish. It means that you're Orthodox, or at least, traditionally minded, which is its own culture, with its own additional sensitivities, practices, and traditions, right? And so you don't want to, yeah.
Hannah Guzman just had her baby.
How it would go.
Sorry,
Sorry, I just needed to mute the name because they can't have that on.
Oh,
It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, it's not being live streamed, but it will be recorded.
Oh, tell her to remind her son.
No, it's okay, but I'm so glad. All right, so yay, there's a new baby in the congregation. Good. All right, so any questions on a kippah? And And believe it or not, a kippah is one of those things you don't have to be Jewish to wear. It's a sign of respect. So even if you're like, for example, just a contractor who's coming into a synagogue to do some work, especially in an Orthodox synagogue, they'll hand you a kippah. Like if you're coming into the synagogue, it doesn't matter for what floor, then you cover your hair. Your head is a sign of respect. So any questions related to a kippah?
So I saw that woman wearing two, white, which both female and male between wearing.
Oh, like some women who will wear a kippah? Yeah, it's become a practice where sometimes women have their own like kippah, which are like much more feminine, but it can be a practice. It doesn't have to, but it's just kind of has become there are many women who will wear a kippah also. Especially
Like
because
Dorothy, who's a cantor.
yeah.
It's
And like women rabbis and and in like Reformed synagogues in other parts of it, but it is
I never saw that.
it's mostly Western culture. So in England, in the United States, kind of like that too, for women, not in Orthodox synagogues. But remember that in more traditional Jews wear wigs or have their heads covered. And so for non-Orthodox women in a synagogue, since they don't have their heads covered another way, they'll wear a kippah, like a kippah is a way to do it, especially if they're going to wear a talit. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Some women don't, and that's okay too, right? It's just there are women who choose to wear a kippah, and there's actually nothing that it's forbidden. It's not considered like, we don't consider it like a man's only garment, especially now that they have female kippot and stuff like this. So, all right, what about a talit? A talit is, right, a prayer shawl is a four-cornered garment traditionally worn by Jewish worshipers during prayer and fulfillment of the commandment in Numbers 15:37-41, right? That says you should put tzitzit on the corners of your garment so that, and attach a thread of blue so that you will look upon them and remember all the commandments of the Lord so that you will do them, so that you won't have to stray after your heart and eyes after which you want to go straight, right? This is one of those things that is a signed covenant, because the whole point of doing it is that you remember the covenant that God made with your ancestors, right? It says. And so the tzitzit are symbolic of the commandments themselves. So there are 4 knots. I could go grab my talit to show you, but if you see it, there's like, but at the top are all these knots, right?
Yeah.
So there are 5 main knots, and then there are 4 windings in between those. So when you take the 4 strings, fold them over, plus the number of knots and everything, it adds up to 613. So there's 613 commandments, right? And the 5 knots are the 5 books of the Torah, and the 4 knots are the sacred name of God, Yod He Vav He, right? Which we say Adonai.
Oh, okay.
So you're literally, when you look upon them, you remember the commandments of the Lord in order to do them, like literally in fulfillment of what the Torah says.
That's excellent.
To do, right? And this is a great example of where the Torah, you would think that the Torah contains all the information we need, but it doesn't often when you go to do it like in a literal sense. It's not always clear what you're supposed to do. So Numbers 15 tells you put tzitzit on the corners of your garment, but never once does it define what tzitzit are, how they're supposed to be tied, how to like all of that is tradition, right? So the long tassels on a talit are called tzitzit and this is where I just mentioned this. And have a specific purpose according to the Torah to remind us of the commandments and our requirements to observe them. Each of the numbers of strings, knots, and windings all add up to 613, the number of commandments in the Torah. Unlike a kippah, wearing a talit denotes a practice that is uniquely Jewish and demands a fuller understanding of its meaning and use. Therefore, non-Jews should be discouraged from wearing a talit, as it is one of the quintessential signs and reminders of Israel's unique covenant with Hashem. Now, I would say, if your practice at home is to wear a talit and you're not Jewish, that's fine. That's between you and God. It's just in the synagogue, right? It's really should be. A talit carries very special cultural and spiritual meaning within the Jewish community and should be treated respectfully. A talit should never be worn into a restroom and is only worn at morning services, except to wearing a talit at night exceptions to wearing a talit at night are when it is worn by the prayer leader, like a rabbi or cantor, or on Erev Yom Kippur. On Erev Yom Kippur is the only evening service where everyone who does wear a talit wears a talit. Normally, you only do it during the day, and the reason is because of the literalness of reading the verse that when you look upon them, you shall remember, and if you can't see them because it's dark, then you don't have the obligation to see them. So the idea is we only put on a talit only for daytime services. And the exception for that is Yom Kippur, and the reason why it's an exception on Yom Kippur, unless you're a prayer leader, is because traditionally the Yom Kippur service starts before sundown. So traditionally it starts before sundown, so it's still daytime when you start the service. All right, any questions so far? That's totally fine, because it's not a talit. Yeah, any other kind of head covering or whatever is, or like a scarf or whatever is okay, because it's not a talit. A talit is a specific thing. Even if, for example, if I wear one of these striped, like a prayer shawl, and it doesn't have tzitzit, then it's not only is it not only is it okay, well, here, you can put it back up here. And not only is it fine, but if you're Jewish, you're not actually fulfilling the commandment to wear tzitzit, because the commandment is not the scarf or the shawl. The commandment is the tzitzit that are on them. This is why when a Jewish person dies, men are traditionally buried in their talit, and the tzitzit are cut. Why? Because you're no longer obligated to observe the mitzvot. You're dead. Right? You're now, it's the the commandments are only applied to those who are alive. In heaven, not that there isn't Torah, but the commandments of the Torah don't apply to us in the same way. It applies to us differently in a resurrected sense. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this word by word, but this is an explanation of the service, the major sections, right? The Birkot HaShachar, which is the earlier prayers. Pazukah de Zimra is where we begin our service, usually here. Then you have the Baruch Hu, right? The call to worship. The Shema and its blessings, the Amidah, a little bit about Tfilat Hadon, which is obviously a uniquely Messianic Jewish thing. They're not gonna do the Lord's Prayer in your average synagogue. The Torah service, and for us, not only in the way that we understand the symbolism of the Torah service, but traditional synagogues don't include, for example, readings from the New Testament. That's And then the Aleinu and the Mourner's Kaddish. So you can read through, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this because I want to spend time talking about Kashrut. But you have here on page, 4? I gave you kind of the climax of the service, right? You can see you have the warm-up prayers, Birkot HaShachar, and if you need to go back and look at what that is, it's at the top of the previous page. Those are what we call like the warm-up prayers. And then every major section is separated by a form of the Kaddish. So for example, we do Kaddish de Rabbanan and Kaddish Yatom, which is the mourner's Kaddish, before we get into the songs of praise, and which are mostly psalms. And then you have a Kaddish, and then you have the Baruch Hu and the Shema, right? And then you have the Amidah. And then on holidays, we have what's called Hallel, right? We do an abbreviated form of Hallel here. And the Torah service is separated by a Kaddish Shalem. We don't do Musaf here, which would be an additional Amidah, but sometimes we do, for example, Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu. That's from Musaf, which is the reason why Musaf just means addition. It's from the same, like Yosef means just a supplement, an addition. So it's the same root where we get the name Joseph, but Musaf just means it's an additional, because on Shabbat, why on Shabbat and festivals? Because there was an additional offering that was offered in the temple on Shabbat and holidays. So because there was this, remember, our prayers now take the form of the offerings and sacrifices, and we ourselves become living sacrifices. So without a temple, our prayers, we offer our prayers, and we offer an additional Amidah as a musaf, like as an additional, instead of an actual sacrifice, nowadays it's prayer, right? Despite what certain anti-Semites you might read online, Jews have not done sacrifices since the temple was destroyed, because the way that it came to be evolved is once the temple was built, that could be the only place that for Jews you can offer sacrifices. Without the temple and the priestly system, then we can't do sacrifices anymore. So sadly, throughout the Middle Ages, it was common for, if you've ever heard the term blood libel,
Say
it
that
happened,
again.
a blood libel. Blood libels happened all the time. It's where there would be an uprising often it happened during Easter, because there were the Easter pageants they would do were often very, very anti-Semitic, because like blaming the Jews for killing Jesus and stuff. So often there would be these pogroms like afterwards, and often one of the claims would be, and this especially happened when Christian children would come up missing, they would blame the Jews because we needed their blood to make matzah or to do sacrifices and stuff. But the stupid thing is like, we don't even do sacrifices. So we're not even going to use, not only do we would never, children are not kosher. We'll talk about that in a second, but like, we don't
so much.
right. Anyway, blood. Also, Jews have hangups with blood. Like if you know anything about kashrut, everything that we do in the preparation of the meat is to get rid of as much blood as possible. So we're not going to add blood to our matzah. And anyway, it's stupid, but sadly, this happened all the time throughout the Middle Ages, and even up until there was a blood libel in the early 1900s and stuff. And so, yeah, I mean. Yeah, I mean, there are people that think the Jews still people believe this. So there's a
the blood of the baby.
It's stupid.
Yeah.
Right. So one of my heroes who I quoted from in my sermon last week, Paul Philip Levertov. I'm sorry, a different hero, Rabbi Isaac Lichtenstein, who became a follower of Yeshua, and he was the chief rabbi of the Northern District of Hungary. Part of his coming to faith involved a situation where there was a blood libel. And he was so moved by the fact that who came to the Jewish community's defense was this Christian pastor who was a Christian Hebraist, like super, a specialist in Hebrew, and he came to the defense of the Jewish community. And Isaac Lichtenstein was so moved by this that it was part of what made him open to even considering reading the New Testament but the context of all of that was a blood libel. There's a young girl that it was in Hungary, I think when Tapiosele was the name of the city that particular blood libel happened. And unfortunately, as often would happen, that they found the body of the girl some months later. And then they actually discovered who did it, and it wasn't anybody Jewish, and it wasn't the Jewish community. But unfortunately, there was this whole situation where there would usually be lynchings and stuff that would kill Jews over, accusing us of drinking, that we needed. There's this idea that existed that somehow Jews can't observe Passover without Christian blood, which is so ridiculous. But anyway, but people still believe this nonsense, as Yaakov was just saying. There are people that believe this. All right, so let's move on. Any questions about prayer, the synagogue, the garments of prayer? And when we go into a class on prayer, we'll talk more about these things. But again, this is just a quick crash course. Even though it's 8 weeks, each week we just can't, it's a quick taste of just each topic that we're talking about each week. So any questions so far?
And when you accept blood products like transfusion?
Yeah. So things like that, if it's medically related, a blood transfusion is okay. But drinking blood would not be okay. Yeah, any medical reasons, even when we talk about kashrut, for example, we don't eat pork or shellfish and things. However, the challenge is that a lot of the coatings of medications, especially, for example, coated Advil and stuff like this, usually has gelatin, which is usually derived from some kind of usually from from like the sinew or whatever, so in the case of medication, an exception is made. If you can get a medication that is kosher, that's preferred, but sometimes your only option is what's there. So Judaism places always a priority of life over death. In order to sustain life, you can violate any of the commands in the Torah in order to sustain life, right?
Vaccinations.
Well, of course, vaccinations are okay and stuff like that. Yeah. What's that?
I said most of the scientists and doctors.
Are Jewish, right? Even religious Jews, right? But yeah, there were certain. Yeah, no, so the Jewish community tends especially towards medicine and medical practices and stuff, pretty open-minded. Not that we don't have thoughts on it, but it's much different. So we're not, for example, like Christian Science or whatever that rejects modern medicine. We actually view the way that Judaism views medicine and doctors and stuff is that God uses these people to also work miracles, right? That miracles can happen like directly through the intervention of God, or God can use other people in our lives to act a miracle for us. And so, do we still believe God, works miracles? Of course, but He could also use you in order to bring a healing to Vivian or to me or to Richard, or you know what I mean? So, yeah, very much so. And so, even for example, doctors who are Orthodox are allowed to work on Shabbat in order to save a life, right? Because the priority of life over, that you can actually technically violate any commandment in the Torah, except for the top three that I mentioned in my sermon: murder, idolatry, and murder, right? Nothing is going to force you to do one of those three things. Like if you're a doctor on Shabbat, right? It shouldn't lead to you hooking up with one of the nurses, or you know what I mean? Like, but if you're going to save somebody's life and that kind of stuff, then you are allowed, even as an Orthodox doctor, to, for example, if you're called in, let's say I'm an Orthodox Jew, but I'm a physician and there's nobody available and they call me in to save somebody's life on Shabbat, I can drive to the hospital and perform the surgery, even though it's Shabbat or a holiday. Even though I'm Orthodox, is because of what's called pikuach nefesh, of the value of life.
Rabbi, I just wanted to.
Sure.
remind
Yeah,
us
yeah.
that The Lord said, "What man of you, if his oxen falls into the well,
Right.
will not go and do
Even on
on
Shabbat.
Shabbat?"
And this has to do with that idea that I talked about, how the priority of relational commands, that if something is a commandment that has to do with relationally with your relationship with somebody else, that takes priority over something that only involves yourself. Question.
I don't want to get.
No, it's okay.
A rabbit hole, but you guys are also teaching on Galatians. I was curious how you guys deal with like Galatians 2 and 3. That's very much like if you're trying to complete with the law, like the flesh, what was done in the spirit,
Right.
You're alienating yourself from Christ.
Right. So, I mean, in just a quick, Rabbi Tony just did a whole series on
Right, so maybe I
Galatians.
just
No,
need to
it's okay.
watch his
No,
classes.
it's okay. No, it's a good question. And I think the important thing to always keep in mind, especially when you're dealing with the New Testament, is who is the audience. Paul is not writing to Jews, he's writing to Galatians, to the
Right,
church.
like
And
me.
well, he's writing to those who are not Jewish, but also his concern is to also for not people to just follow the Torah out of a blind sense of what we would today call legalism. The challenge is that there's no word in Hebrew or Greek for this term legalism. But Paul is clearly talking about at times in which criticizing people for basically going through the motions, right? Or teaching. He's also combating what's called the Judaizers, right? Is that those who are teaching that Gentiles have to do these things in order to be saved. Well, that's a contradiction of Acts 15, when the determination was Gentiles don't have to convert to Judaism in order to be saved. And the decision that the weight of the mitzvot does not apply to them in the same way. Not that it doesn't at all, but not that in the same way that it does for Jews, right? Peter says, James says, why should we place a yoke on the necks of the Gentiles? What is the yoke? The weight of the covenantal responsibility of the Torah. Why should we place this on the neck of the Gentiles who are turning to God? Instead, let's send out a letter that says, avoid these three or four things, and the rest will be taught in synagogues, meaning we'll figure this out, and Gentiles and Jews will come together in the synagogue and we'll work this out. But these are the primary things. But what we know for sure, and we're establishing now, is that all of the obligations are not and what sparked this is it says, Acts 15 starts out as there are those who are teaching that Gentiles have to be circumcised, which means convert to Judaism and observe all of the Torah. And it says this was no small matter, right?
Yeah.
And so it was such a big deal that they call the apostles, the family of Yeshua, and the elders together, the Jerusalem Council, in order to decide this issue. So what's going on in Galatians is a different context. A lot of like the new moon festivals and stuff they're talking about are not Jewish ones, they're pagan ones. And so, but also then he's trying to balance of like also, a sense of legalism. The specifics on that, it's been especially since Rabbi Tony taught on it recently, like the specifics and the details. He could probably better answer that than I could, but just
It's
in
on YouTube,
general.
right?
Yeah.
I should just
I think
watch
so.
what
No,
you guys
but-
say on it clearly.
No, but what I would definitely say is with Paul, especially, you have to balance the fact that number one, his audience is predominantly Gentile. And so he's dealing with different issues, and he's usually trying to encourage them against the teachings that had been done previously by these, whatever they mean by Judaizers, these people who are trying to tell the Gentiles that in order to be saved, they have to convert to Judaism.
Right.
And the issue with that is that it's not that they can't convert to Judaism, it's just they don't have to in order to be saved. It's not a salvation issue, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And so there's different issues that they're dealing with, like Paul is dealing with in his letters versus what, the other writers are dealing with. So, okay. Do we even have time? Let me just hit this really quick. Because it's already 3, but we'll just hit this really quick. Do you want to just go around to each person again, read a paragraph if you haven't read yet? Anybody who wants to?
I can start.
Oliver, yeah, please go for it. It's Oliver, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So with the first commandment?
Yeah.
I'm starting, okay. From MJRC, Standards of Observance.
The MJRC is Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, of which our congregation is a part of. So, and Rabbi Tony and I are part of the MJRC.
Cool. The first commandment given to humankind was about food, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, "You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die." Genesis 2, verses 16 through 17. Why this commandment? Why not the command to till the earth and subdue it? Why not some other command? Why is this one the very first and therefore the most prominent?
Next, anybody else want to read? Okay, Richard, please.
Okay, so for the reason is that there is nothing more person, nothing which we are so inclined to think was as nobody business, but our own. And the question of what we chosen to put in our mouths,
Right?
not grown irritated with someone who says to us, "Do you think you should eat it?"
Do you think we should eat
Eat it, back off.
Yeah,
People's heads start
just leave me alone, okay? It's none of your business.
And for many, even when the doctor tried to regulate our.
We just hurt them.
Yeah, we feel invaded.
Should all say.
Yeah, or demoralized, right? Okay, who wants to read next?
So the command not to eat of the tree of knowledge and good of good and evil was a relationship test in the garden. Would Adam and
And Chava is Eve.
Hava
Yeah.
respect God's right to regulate their lives even to the point of restricting their diet? Kashrut is not primarily about food. It is all about relationship. Every time a religious Jew eats a kosher meal, she is reminded that she is a Jew and that God is really God. And when we fail to eat like Jews, we weaken our awareness that we are part of a holy people and that the God who established a covenant with us has right over our lives.
So this is why I was referring to earlier, this idea of kashrut as a diet for the soul, right? That there was one time I was flying on an airline. This is actually when I was living in Hungary. And I remember sitting, this is a long time ago when I was a lot younger, and I was sitting next to this young woman who was very good looking, and I was very intimidated. So I didn't say anything to her, right? So, but then of course, when the food comes and I get my meal before everybody else, she asks me, why is your meal different than everybody else's? And I said, oh, well, it's because I ordered the kosher meal. And she's like, well, what's kosher? And I said, well, I follow a biblical diet, which, the Bible says, well, there are things you can eat and things that you can't eat. And she's like, well, that's stupid. I was already nervous, and now she just told me that what I do. And so I once I recovered, I said, well, because I could tell it looked like she, was involved in like sports and stuff.
And she doesn't
And-
need their pork products. Okay.
Well, no, I could tell that she was like, did sports and stuff like that. So I just said, oh yeah, I used to run track and cross country. And so, there were certain things that I would eat or not eat in order to get the most optimum physical performance out of it. And she was like, oh yeah, I do the same thing. I don't eat this and I don't eat that or whatever. And I said, well, earlier you asked me about kashrut, and that's also why I eat certain things and don't eat certain things, is to get the most optimum spiritual performance out of it. And so when I said it that way, she was like, oh, well, that's actually interesting, because she was thinking in the whole like, oh, the Bible's all about do's and don'ts. I was like, actually, it's a little more interesting than that, rather than a list of like, thou shalt and thou shalt nots. So, but that always stuck with me because like it just came out of me. I don't know where I got this, but like a diet for the soul, it's like that's what it is. It's spiritual eating, right? That just as there are physical diets, this is a spiritual diet. So, all right, who wants to read the next?
I just want to say, interestingly, Daniel, when Daniel with king.
Yeah, and he takes on
he was stronger than the other ones. He was just eating the
right.
the legumes.
Right. So he's like, yeah, exactly. Okay, so go ahead.
Sure, it's also the very nature of being Jewish.
Now, I realize this language is speaking to those who are Jewish, but if you are, if you're part of a Messianic Jewish congregation and you're not Jewish, like this can also apply, in some sense to you. So, all right, is somebody asking a question or no? Okay, go ahead.
And shall not be numbered with the nations. Every time Jews eat kosher, they remind themselves, their children, and all around them that they are Jews. By eating kosher, we are met not only to stand apart from the other nations, but to stand together with each other. Eating kosher is a means of group identity and cohesion. And whenever that practice is abandoned, group identity and cohesion suffers. But something far more crucial is compromised as well, honor of God.
All right, thank you. Fabian, do you want to read the last paragraph?
When we eat the way Jews eat, we honor them. We tell God, ourselves, and all who observe us, Hashem is our God, and we are Hashem's speakers. And isn't that again, it's all about relationship. It's easy to say that we love God, but Yeshua reminds us that words are not enough. They never are. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. John 14. And that applies also even first to food.
Right, and that involves even food, right? So that's from the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, the Standards of Observance, that kind of description of kashrut. So what makes things kosher? I'm just going to hit this really quick and then we'll wrap up. There are certain things that define what is kosher. What can we eat or not eat? Primarily Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, 3 through 21. So define, like, for example, Leviticus 11 defines, the different things that you can eat and not eat.
Because daddy to thank God.
Hey, Sally, don't keep opening the door. You can either come in.
It just takes longer.
Sorry, everyone.
You're smart to be a parent.
You want Abba to be done?
Almost.
It's like Abba, come home already. So the other thing, so Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. So Leviticus 11 defines 3 different types of things. It defines the categories for what we can eat of mammals. It defines the requirements for birds. So for mammals, it has to chew its cud and have a split hoof. But Chewits cud meanings like there are certain animals that have multiple stomachs, right? And that they go through multiple processing of through their different stomachs. So cows, llamas, like I think, no, llamas are not, maybe. Anyway, the cows
No,
for
'cause they have the
sure.
wrong feet.
Yeah, they have the wrong feet, but anyway, but then have like a split hoof, but don't chew its cud. So for example, pigs have a split hoof, but they don't chew its cud. So for mammals, it has to have those two things. So you can eat sheep, cows, all kinds of stuff, right? Technically giraffe, and how many people actually eat giraffe? I'm sure there's some. No, but it's technically kosher. It's got a split hoof and it chews its cud, so it's kosher. But and then also fish. Fish have to have fins and scales. So for example, shark is not kosher because it has fins, but no scales. Right. All right. So the other thing is no butts. According to Genesis 30 or 32.
What? Okay.
So it has to do, actually, this is wrong. I think it's main 22:33. In Genesis, after Jacob, no, maybe it is 32. After Jacob wrestles with this personification of God, he asks God, "What is your name? Nobody can know my name, right? I won't go until you bless me." And what does this being do? It touches his hip socket, and from then on, he has a limp. And it says, and from that day on to this day, we don't eat the sinew. So things like rump roasts, other kinds of cuts that come from the booty, from the rump of the animal, Jews don't eat because it's really difficult to remove that sinew. And so usually those parts are sold to like a non-kosher butcher because they don't have the same requirements. But especially Ashkenazi Jews will not eat cuts that traditionally come from those, and you can't buy them in a kosher. Now, Sephardic Jews will, though, because they will go through the difficult work to actually extract that sinew. It's just really difficult. So Ashkenazi Jews can just sell it.
Is it just one side or both sides?
It's both sides.
I used to think it was just one.
I think it's just, it only happened to Jacob on one side, but I think the issue is we don't know. I don't know if it says which side, and so I think just to be safe, we won't eat either side. So the other thing is avoiding blood, right? Deuteronomy 12:23, because of the life of the soul is of the flesh is in the blood. So kashrut, part of what we do is not only is it the way that it's slaughtered, but then the meat is soaked and salted in order to remove as much of the blood as possible. Like it's impossible to remove all blood, but as much of the blood must be drained out. So it's soaked and salted.
Yeah.
So it's used. So has everybody ever gone to the grocery store and you see kosher salt?
Yeah.
So what is kosher salt? It's grains of salt that are more coarse than your average table salt. Why? It's because it's the kind of salt that you use when koshering, so that you cover the meat with this kosher salt, and you leave it on there so that it draws out the blood, and you'll leave it on there for like a day or so, and then you rinse it off. So unfortunately, kosher meat can tend to be very salty just because it gets salted. But what that means though is that it used to be like our grandmothers and stuff would have to do this at home, but when you buy kosher meat now, it's all pre-soaked and salted, so you don't need to re-salt the meat. Anyway, so another thing is avoiding blood. We do what we can to rid the blood. The other thing is ritual shetita. It says in Deuteronomy 12:21 that you should slaughter it the way that I commanded you. So it's not just that we avoid certain kinds of animals, we also has to be slaughtered according to a ritual slaughter. So, all right, we're almost done. All right, just bear with me for 5 more minutes. Okay, what about milk and meat, right? Because traditionally, kashrut does not mix milk and meat. And it comes from the verses, and there are multiple places where it says, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Obviously, in its historical context, it probably didn't mean not mixing milk and meat. It had to do with literally it's from this idea of being overly hostile, right? That if you have a small animal, it's considered cruel and unusual to then cook it inside the milk of its mother, right? In the same way the Torah says, right? And the Torah says if you're gonna take the eggs from a nest, shoo away the mother, right? So she doesn't have to see you take her babies, right? You know, her potential babies. So in the same way, so milk and meat from very early, from even before the time of Yeshua, this commandment was interpreted as mixing milk and meat. And the reason we know this is because some of the Aramaic Targumim, you know, the Aramaic, it's not just a straight translation, they're also commentaries. The way that it translates this verse is it says you should, it doesn't say cook a kid in its mother's milk, it says you should not cook milk and meat together. So already by the Aramaic Targumim, they're translating this verse with that understanding. Now, some people might not do that. You know, there's a lot of people who in the Messianic movement who follow what they call biblical kosher, which basically just means they don't eat pork and shellfish. But technically, biblical kosher would include at least eating kosher meat, like that's been slaughtered. But anyway, I realize we're all doing what we can. So I'm just giving you this is what it is, and then you know you can wrestle with how you apply that in a manageable, meaningful, and maintainable way. All right, so simple ways to get started. Let's say that you've already felt convicted about, like, I want to, you know, the Bible says I shouldn't eat pork, so I don't want to do it, or whatever. So here's some, if you want to get started, some simple how-tos. Start slow. Remember, go back to meaning and maintenance. Yeah. Why are you doing this, and how can you do it in a way that's manageable? The best way to get started is just simply avoid, which is harder than it sounds, but to avoid pork, shellfish, and fins, and fish without fins and scales. Like that's the easiest way to get started. And those are the kinds of things that are harder to do anyway, right? So for example, to order something fish without fins and scales, most of us, for example, unless we go to a seafood restaurant, don't eat shark, for example, or sturgeon, right? If we go out to eat or we order sushi or whatever, it's usually going to be like tuna or salmon or something that has fins and scales, right? You know, pork is a little harder just because they put bacon in everything or wrap it in bacon or, you know, whatever. The other thing you have to be very careful about, especially because, you know, I'm from the West Coast, from Los Angeles, where everything is made with lard. So that's hard. Ooh, you know, so you just get used to asking, like, you know, like one of the things I miss is good Mexican and Latin American food. But I also learned I had to ask all the time, is this made with lard? Are the beans vegetarian or are they have pork in it, right? So you just have to learn, you know, you just get used to asking these kinds of questions. So, but the good thing is in more recent years, everybody does like vegetarian beans nowadays. It's pretty common. Although I found a couple restaurants around here that still don't, which is too bad. Anyway, so slowly, the other thing you can do, you know, the first thing to do is just avoid the biblical basics of avoid pork, shellfish, and fish without fins and scales. Slowly begin buying, you know, another thing you can do is if you feel led to do it, is slowly begin buying products with what's called a hechsher. And below, I realize there's some redundancies, but each list had some ones that the other one didn't. What's called a hechsher is, these are different rabbinical organizations that do kosher certifying. And so you might not have ever noticed that on most of your prepackaged food, you will find one of these symbols. On prepackaged food that's not either meat or, and so what that is it means that it's been certified kosher by some kind of rabbinical organization. The other thing you can do if you have questions is consult the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council. You can go to our website. When in doubt, ask your rabbi, right? That's a good way to do things. And a great reference book from a Messianic Jewish perspective is there's a book called Biblically Kosher by Aaron Eby, and you can get it. The best place to get it, because it's more expensive, believe it or not, on Amazon than it is in their website, is First Fruits of Zion is a great organization. They have great teaching and stuff from a Messianic Jewish perspective. And their website, ffoz.org, is the best place to buy that book. Biblically Kosher. If you want, you know, kind of, so that's, like I said, just a quick overview of Kashrut and some other things. So before we close, any questions, comments, revolts? stone throwing. That's why I don't hand out rocks. You know, people will actually use them on me. I'm just kidding.
Then I feel obligated to stop bleeding.
I'm ready to go home. All right, Vivian.
Put this question, but when you go to the market and you see halal, because they follow a strict rule also. What is the?
Halal, they trade Allah.
Well, no, so, I mean, so halal.
It's similar,
So,
it's similar.
it is similar.
Terms are different.
So, wait, let me answer the question. I'm the rabbi. Because this is halakhic questions. So Muslims can eat kosher, but Jews cannot eat halal. And the reason is not because they're monotheists. Actually, they're considered more kosher than technically Christians are.
Yeah.
The problem for Jews with halal is they, for example, can eat shellfish. And so there are things that although they can't eat pork,
They don't eat pork.
they don't eat pork, but they can
They
eat shellfish and
yeah.
stuff. And so, and their slaughter is different than ours. And so it's a little different. If necessary, like I will, for example, eat in a halal restaurant. Yes, well, I mean,
I don't ask questions.
most of the ones you go to, for example, they're gonna be like, especially around here, most of the halal restaurants are Turkish. Not all of them, but there a lot of the Turkish restaurants are halal. And a lot of Middle Eastern countries don't eat shellfish. It's not a big deal. Like Mediterranean isn't really big on like shrimp and stuff. Not that you won't ever see it. It's just not very common. So, but you know, but in Asian cooking and stuff, like forget about it. You know, it's in everything.
Growing up, when Muslims are having their Ramadan, the way the animal is slaughtered,
It is very similar, right? That's why I would say like it's probably better than just buying your regular grocery store, which has very little requirements for the way that it can be slaughtered. Judaism is not only this idea of life, but it's very concerned about the ethics of slaughter. And so the process of shechita is what it's called. Shechita is the slaughtering. Shechita has to be very humane. And so of all the different ways to slaughter an animal, shechita is the most humane because it's an immediate. Like in order for it to be a kosher cut, it has to be one slice. First of all, it's a super, super, super sharp blade. And in one cut, you have to slice the trachea and so that it all happens in one. And if you have to go back over it, then it's considered torn. It's not kosher and you have to sell it to a regular slaughterhouse. So it has to be immediate. And so like this animal, literally, it doesn't even have time to feel pain and stuff. It's like, it's an immediate thing.
Because when I feel pain, can I add a
Yeah.
There's a very boost of adrenaline goes into
Yes.
the body.
And it toughens up the meat too.
Contaminated with these hormones, which is not supposed to be
They're
there.
still
And it's
fairly
reflecting on
relaxed.
your health.
Believe it or not, one of the least humane ways is to shoot an animal, because obviously you don't get them immediately and it takes time for them to die. And so that can be a really difficult way for, anyway, everything follows shechita, no matter what it is, even a bird is obviously fish or not, you don't check the fish, but chickens are like, or you cut the head off, you're like but animals like sheep and stuff like that have to be slaughtered specifically by shechita.
No, because if you go to a halal market, they'll come and show you the chicken.
Yeah, you want to see the chicken first? Yeah. All right. So any other questions, All right. So God, we pray for the week ahead that you would bless everyone, you would bless and just continue to work through us and in us and we just pray for more of you. We pray all of this in the name of Yeshua. Amen.